Have close to 100 people joining us virtually, and I wanted to thank all of you for taking the time to join this virtual event, which is marking the 80th anniversary of the Battle of El Alamein. My name is Justin Reash, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society, and I'm the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University. Before I introduce my esteemed guests, allow me to remind you of two things. First, this conversation is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Society's YouTube page in the coming days. And second, we would love to hear from you. So please ask questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible later in the program. So to begin, last month, November 2022, marks the 80th anniversary of the British victory at the Battle of El Alamein in November 1942. Alamein is considered the turning point by many, including my guest, of the fortunes of the Allies in World War II. In fact, Churchill himself said, quote, "It marked, in fact, the turning of the hinge of fate. It may also be said, before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat," which is just a slight fib of the truth. But in fact, Churchill was exultant by this victory. It had been more than 2 years since the Battle of Britain began, and the Allies were desperate for a victory, anything really, to stop the Nazi advance across Europe and Africa. To this point, Churchill said, quote, "I have never promised anything but blood, tears, toil, and sweat. Now, however, we have a new experience. We have victory, a remarkable and definite victory." And he concluded his feelings after the battle when speaking to Parliament by tempering expectations. But he was clearly relieved when he said, quote, "Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." Now allow me to introduce my guest, acclaimed author Nigel Hamilton. Nigel is an award-winning historian and biographer. He is author of numerous books on presidents, prime ministers, and military figures, including Field Marshal Montgomery, Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, and Bill Clinton. His BBC documentary, Monty in Love and War, won the New York Blue Ribbon Award. Dr. Hamilton has addressed many meetings of the Churchill Societies, including our annual conference in 2014 in New Orleans, and he is currently a senior fellow in the McCormick Graduate School at UMass Boston and is completing a new biography of the presidents Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis in the Civil War for publication next year, in 2024. And he lives in Massachusetts and New Orleans. Nigel, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Justin, for inviting me to speak on this occasion. I have a particular connection with certainly two of the main people involved in this battle, Field Marshal Montgomery and Sir Winston Churchill, both of whom I actually knew. I mean, it's pretty incredible to be so ancient, but I not only knew Field Marshal Montgomery very well, very well as a student, and stayed at his home in Hampshire in England on many occasions. But he took me to stay for a memorable weekend with Sir Winston and Lady Churchill. And above all, Monty talked to me a great deal about Churchill and his sort of contrary feelings about him as not so much as a leader, but in terms of his interference with Monty's battles. And so, I have spent many years writing about World War II and about the Field Marshal, but like I say, I'm probably not objective in that I knew both of these individuals, and although I am very critical of both of them, I am a huge admirer, even in my old age. And, when I think back to this battle, especially now that I'm working on the Civil War, it's involved, changing my mindset, but it certainly has reminded me, as my last 3 books about FDR in World War II did, it has reminded me how different is the responsibility of a prime minister who is also Minister of War, Minister of Defense, or a president who is commander-in-chief, how different that responsibility is from being just the guy who has to order the troops into battle and try and ensure they win. And so when I look back at the Battle of El Alamein, I think there are 2 ways of looking at it. One is the kind of strategic situation in the summer of 1942, and why this battle was considered to be so, this approaching battle, if you like, was considered so important, and then look at it from the sort of ground up. What did it mean to the people who were actually in the desert? Could I just frame it in terms of the summer of 1942? Because there is a moment which, when I was writing about FDR a couple of years ago, I don't think I'd hitherto taken into account sufficiently, which was the importance of the fall of Tobruk. Tobruk on the north coast, on the Mediterranean coast, North Africa, had been held in 1941. It was a fortress, and Churchill was actually visiting the President of the United States, had stayed with him at Hyde Park. They'd gone on the train together to Washington, to the White House, and he was actually in the White House, in the room, in the Oval Office with FDR, when the news came through that Tobruk had not only been captured by Rommel, but over 30,000 British defenders had surrendered. And Churchill, I think, certainly people who were there described him as kind of visibly shocked. He was embarrassed, ashamed on behalf of Britain. And it is a wonderful moment in history because, one has to see World War II in terms of allies. And if there was a cardinal moment where you could say, this was when allies really mattered, it's when FDR, sensing how upset Churchill is. I think Churchill later wrote something like, now defeat is one thing, but disgrace is another. FDR,
very well done.
FDR said, Prime Minister, or what can we do to help? And Churchill looked rather helpless, and FDR turned to General Marshall, the head of the United States Army, and said, what can we contribute? And it was at that point that he decided to send 300 American Sherman tanks out to the desert, to Cairo, to help the British in their hour of need and take them away from any American attempt to land in Europe. So, that I think is in a sense the beginning. It's it's an embarrassing moment, but it also illustrates just how important this moment was in terms of the alliance, but also militarily, because at that point, the Russians were barely holding out against the Nazis on the Eastern Front, and Rommel was streaking forwards with his Panzer Army. Hitler was jubilant and made Rommel a field marshal. And clearly, Rommel felt there was no reason why, having defeated the British so roundly, why he shouldn't make for Egypt and seize the Suez Canal and cut the British off from India. And so it is a very important moment. And Churchill is deeply grateful, but also feels a responsibility to do something. And that's when Churchill decides to go out himself. A brave man, I mean, he's almost 70 years old, to go out and to the desert and see what the hell is going on. What is the matter with the British in Egypt? Why are they not able, with all their equipment and troops, huge superiority in troops and so forth, plenty of tanks and so on, how is it possible that they can't stop this German Panzer Army, Germans and Italians? So, I think it says a great deal for Churchill that he got on a plane, went out there and fired the commander-in-chief, who himself had to fire his battlefield commanders, two of them, and take over the Eighth Army in the field of battle after Tobruk. So Churchill, I'm very aware of this because I see, in looking at the Civil War, I'm very aware of how Lincoln, by contrast, was initially very unwilling to go on to the battlefield, unwilling to meet commanders on the battlefield, and very timid in terms of firing them when they were not performing. Well, it's a tribute to Churchill that he recognized once he got to Cairo that Auchinleck had done as best he could. He was an honorable man, but he simply was talking too much about retreat, and therefore he would have to do something. And it's at that point in early August of 1942 that Churchill decides not only to replace Auchinleck with General Alexander, but to replace or to appoint a new army commander for the British Eighth Army, which was a Commonwealth army. It had South Africans, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, and he chose the wrong man. This was one of the most extraordinary and interesting things, that Churchill, in a strategic sense, is wonderfully insightful and experienced, and yet when it comes to individuals, is not a good picker of men. And so Churchill goes out to the desert, to the front line, again with great courage, really, interviews some of the corps commanders at the Eighth Army at Alamein, which is about 60 miles west of Alexandria, very close to the sea. Interviews some of the corps and divisional commanders, and decides that one of them, a man called General Gott, should be the new Eighth Army commander. And everybody back in Cairo says, Prime Minister, no, this man is tired. He doesn't have... Yes. So, but Churchill, one of his great virtues was his obstinacy. It was also at times, a disadvantage. And obstinately, he said, no, General Gott's the man, and appoints him. And so the message went out to the headquarters of the Eighth Army at Alamein saying General Gott is good to be the new army commander. And instead of taking over immediately, Gott asked if he could have a few days rest and take a bath and whatever. And instead of driving back to Cairo, he got on a plane, perhaps wrongly, morally, because it was an ambulance plane, and he shouldn't really have gone on it. Anyway, it was shot down by German Messerschmitts, and he was killed. And so Churchill was actually forced to appoint Monty. And we should say something now about Monty.
Of course, and if I might say, in one of the many quirks of history, which I feel like kind of happened in this battle, Gott being shot down, Rommel not being present initially. Did you ask Field Marshal Montgomery about Gott's death? Did you ever ask, just out of curiosity? That obviously was a turning point in his career and his life. Did you ever ask him about that?
I didn't ask him about Gott. Richard Gott. I at least I can't remember him talking about him. I don't think he really knew him. But I did speak to I knew General Sir Ian Jacob very well, who was Churchill's military assistant, and who was in Cairo with Churchill when the decision was made. And Sir Ian Jacob said, we were all fretting because we just, he was a military man, and they just, he knew God, and he knew that he wasn't the right choice. So he said, oh, we thank the Lord. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say when news came through that Gott had been killed. But it is one of those sort of accidents of history.
Wow. Yeah.
And the truth is, at that point, Churchill didn't, I'm not sure that he ever really liked Monty. He certainly admired him genuinely. And I'm not sure how many people ever did like Monty. I remember the Oxford historians, Sir Edgar Williams of Rhodes House, Oxford, he once said to me, well, of course, Monty wasn't a nice man, but then nice men don't win wars. Monty had a talent for irritating people and saying exactly what he thought, and being obnoxious, basically. And
I was going to say, I wonder if that's why him and Churchill didn't really get on that well, because they were very similar in many ways.
Well, certainly Churchill was pugnacious. The famous story that when they meet after Dunkirk on the south coast of England, and British are preparing for a German invasion in 1940, and Churchill, as Prime Minister, goes down to visit, because Churchill really was, as Minister of Defense, he was the same as the United States President in the sense that he was the commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
So he goes down to the south coast, and he reviews Monty's division that's preparing for the German invasion, and then he says, General, can I take you to dinner? And he takes him to dinner at this hotel at Brighton, and they're sitting there, and Monty is boasting about how there's nothing going to, he's going to whack the Germans the moment they land on the coast, and whatever it is, and he says, of course, you have to be fit. He says, I don't smoke, I don't drink, and I'm 100% fit. And, Churchill looks at him and puffs on his cigar and says, General, I smoke and I drink his whiskey, and I'm 200% fit. Now, what's interesting to me is that Monty would tell me that story again and again. He loved it. He'd meet his match. Like when you just said, they were similar in certain ways. And I think that's why the question of whether they liked each other isn't really apposite. I think the truth was that they appreciated each other's virtues and criticized their, their failings, if you like. But so they hadn't got on well in England, and Churchill had, I think, pretty much deliberately not promoted Monty to field command. So it was Churchill who had appointed General Auchinleck to the Middle East, and before Auchinleck, General Wavell. As each one fails Churchill, he's looking for somebody else, and still doesn't choose Monty. But when Monty is the only candidate, at that point, Monty had been appointed to command the British troops as part of the American invasion of Northwest Africa, Torch, which was going to take place in November. And it's really the relationship between Torch and Alamein that makes this Battle of Alamein so definitive.
Yeah.
Because again, I think it's a sign of FDR's greatness that whereas FDR's generals all said, no, we've got to land across the channel, we need a D-Day, come on, the Russians are in great difficulty, we've just got to get going. And FDR, who had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, had been to Europe in that role during the war, knew that, no American soldier had ever shot a rifle at a German. How were they going to land against 25 German divisions on the coast of France in the summer of 1942? After all, it's only half a year after Pearl Harbor. How on earth did he? And yet the chiefs of staff, General Marshall, Admiral King, insisted, it was called Bolero, insisted that they should have landings on the coast of France and get going. And it was FDR who said, I am the commander-in-chief. This is ridiculous. No, what we will do is land in Northwest Africa, in Vichy French Morocco, and move into Tunisia. And while there are no Germans there, and we'll get a foot in Europe. And that way we can learn how to defeat the Germans in battle. But it was so important that, after all, he was launching American troops from the United States, having to cross the Atlantic before they even set foot on Moroccan sand or soil. It was vital that the British should do their part and stop Rommel from seizing Cairo and the Suez Canal. And that is what Monty did. He was transferred from the Torch invasion to the Eighth Army in the desert on the, I think it was like the 8th of August 1942. By the 12th of August, he was in Cairo. He realized that the British in Cairo, at the sort of general headquarters, were all talking about retreating up to, there were plans for going up into Palestine, up into the Sinai Desert, and with part of the armies and partly going up to Khartoum. And Monty, who had this obnoxious character, said, well, this is not the way to defeat the Germans. So he went out to the desert as the new commander, took over, and there are historians who have felt particularly concerned at Monty's ungentlemanly behavior, that he was rude to the people whom he fired out in the desert, home or whatever. Almost anybody with grey hair, which I and so there were many historians in Britain, certainly, and some in America, who felt that Monty had been very unfair on his predecessor, General Auchinleck, and claimed that he'd really taken over the plans that Auchinleck had already devised for defeating Rommel, and that it was all a foregone conclusion statistically because the army was larger than the Panzer Army. I just felt annoyed by that because the particular historian who really started that whole thing was called Corelli Barnett, who sadly died a few months ago at a very advanced age. But he really didn't interview anybody. I thought he was very, although he did become head of the Churchill archives, which I thought was outrageous, at Cambridge. He didn't bother to interview the people who were there. And one of perhaps my only advantage when I undertook to write Monty's biography in the late 1970s was that many of these characters were still alive. So I was able to interview Monty's chief of staff, his chief of intelligence, his chief of plans, his personal staff who sat down with him every day and took notes and took messages, but who had served not only under Monty, but had served under Monty's predecessor and could compare the two. And they said it was night and day, the difference this one man made. And that's the most difficult thing for a historian to evoke, is the quality that a true leader brings to the room. It's partly charisma. It's partly a kind of dominating personality. Who knows what? But certainly charisma without intellect is no good. And Monty, he wasn't an intellectual, but by golly, I always thought he was, I was a Cambridge undergraduate with very exaggerated sense of intelligence at the time. But, it was just amazing to me how kind of mathematical Monty was. Everything, it wasn't so much that it had to be done by the book, because he was an anti-authoritarian. He didn't like the book, so to speak, the establishment book, unless he was writing it. It was that he liked order. He liked things to be set out in an easily comprehensible, clear form. And to some degree, in a literary sense, Churchill was the same. It was, Churchill would never allow a telegram to go out without him writing it. They both want to make sure that what they communicate to others is clear. When I was when I was still a schoolboy, Monty loved to take bets. And so he bet me that, and my twin brother, Adrian, that his old school, St. Paul's School in London, would get more scholarships to Oxford and Cambridge that year than our school, Westminster. Well, Adrian and I talked about it, and we said, it's not fair, because our school has some sort of special scholarships that are only available to students from our school. So we better make some accommodation for that, and perhaps weight them, perhaps only a half a point for that. Anyway, we sent Monty this long letter explaining our system. Rubbish, he said, immediately, by return of post. We go by the decision of the Times the day that the scholarships are announced, or the numbers, the statistics. And he lost the bet as a result, but he didn't mind. He kept it clear. And, I'm only trying to evoke myself a little bit of how the effect that this man had on people. Now, you can imagine when he arrives in the desert that August, where people are exhausted, they basically retreated 1,500 miles from Tripoli. A lot of them are fed up with war, and here is this guy who comes out with white knees, is what I was told, because he hasn't been in the sun, and tells them to, buck up, and, starts giving out these orders about how we're going to knock Rommel for 6, and, old cricket terms. But I remember Edgar Williams saying, Nigel, I mean, he said this was in some ways so embarrassing, all this old-fashioned kind of almost Victorian exhortation, but my goodness, we needed it. It was a tonic in the desert. And we suddenly felt, well, yeah, there is no reason why we can't beat this man. Yeah. Well, so they did fight a defensive battle within a couple of weeks of Monty's arrival at Alamein, at a place called Alam Halfa, which is a kind of an escarpment at a little bit inland from the coast. And Monty had moved his headquarters to be beside the RAF, and he'd planned to fight a defensive battle in which there would be no movement. He kicked out all the existing plans, Auchinleck's plans for mobile groups and forward defense location and boxes and so forth. All that was too much, too detailed and too liable to go wrong. There would be miscommunication, and Rommel would just ride his way through the middle. So he managed to stop the German advance with Rommel's new tanks when they arrived at the end of August, within a couple of days. But then he insisted, to Churchill's dismay, that he should have time to rebuild the Eighth Army, to retrain it, to develop new plans, and to start doing things that hadn't been done, like night fighting, to train by night, and to do what Rommel had done, which is attack by moonlight. And so ultimately we come to the beginning of the battle, a 13-day battle on the 23rd of October, 1942. And all the people I interviewed said, you can't imagine what sense of confidence and excitement there was, that there was somebody in charge who knew what he was about. And he would have these orders of the day printed up that are now collector's items. And yes, they were full of Victorian terminology, perhaps a bit religious, the Lord will be with us sort of thing. But in terms of morale, that was that was what counted. Also, whereas Auchinleck really made no attempt to actually go out and talk to his brigadiers, his divisional commanders, his corps commanders. So Monty would go out every day. He would also take out packs of 200 cigarettes. He didn't smoke or drink, but he was fine about other people smoking, except in his presence. So he would hand them out, and he wanted to meet the troops, the ordinary GIs, the sergeants, then the officers. You know, this was a completely fresh attempt to instill confidence. And when Churchill, who had left Cairo and had flown again very bravely to Moscow to see Stalin, when Churchill comes back and drives out to the desert and stays the night with Monty at Monty's new headquarters by the sea, with the RAF, Churchill was just flabbergasted at the difference, the sense of confidence that Monty had instilled, even if he didn't necessarily agree with his detailed plans for the battle. There is a wonderful moment when they're going to have dinner, I think, at this RAF headquarters before Churchill goes back to Cairo from the desert and from Alamein. And Churchill says he'd like to have to bathe in the sea, you know, the Mediterranean.
That's so a very Churchill thing.
So he strips off nude, naked, because he sees all the troops who are there are swimming naked. Nobody, you know, people don't have swimming trunks.
Yeah.
So Churchill goes out naked, and Field Marshal Allenbrook who was head of the British Army, the same as General Marshall here, and Monty are standing there looking, and there is Churchill wading out into the water, and he is swept over by a wave. And then they next see him, when he comes up, his feet are upright, his head is down, and his feet are in the shape of a V sign. You know, so
unbelievable.
Yes, you can see, you know, Churchill had met his match, and Monty too, because Monty felt he had a commander-in-chief, if you like, a prime minister, who had given him this this appointment, finally, a field command, and he was going to make damn sure he performed.
Well, now, with 20 minutes left, I want to make sure we, let's get to the battle. Tell us what actions Monty took.
Yes,
Tell us what actions Monty took, because I read your shortened bio of Montgomery, which really had those silhouettes of the battles in which he commanded. And what I found fascinating in your book was that, like you just said, there was a fresh new way of thinking. He was encouraging one general to go through the minefield with the tanks, and the general just couldn't even think that way. So get to the battle. Tell us some things in which that he brought, which allowed them to win this 14-day battle.
Well, for military historians, this is it's not only a historic battle, like you said earlier. Before Alamein never had a victory, after Alamein never had a defeat, which in general terms is pretty right, with exceptions. But it's a very interesting battle for military historians, because there are virtually no civilians involved. It's in the desert. It's almost like a battle at sea. You can see the formations, the panzers, the artillery, the infantry, the Air Force coming over, and it's all very clear. It's 13 days. It's a lot longer than Gettysburg.
Yeah, it's a long battle.
It's iconic in many ways. Rommel, who was nothing if not a professional, ordered 500,000 mines to be sown in the sand between the sea, the Mediterranean, and this, it's called the Quattara Depression. It's sand that is so deep that nobody can even walk through it. And it's in those sort of 40 miles, it's like a bottleneck, the last bottleneck before you get to Cairo, or 60 miles to Alexandria. And Rommel sowed 500,000 mines. Do you know, to this day, those mines are still coming up, and
that's amazing.
Their legs blown off and whatever.
That's awful.
Because they just couldn't sweep them all up. This wind would blow the sand over them. So Monty's task, this was going to be a pretty static battle, in the sense that he had to somehow blow a hole through these 500,000 mines stretched across 40 miles and backed by Rommel's mobile panzer forces, but also a lot of Italian and German infantry, including parachute troops, pretty tough troops, defending those minefields. And Monty's plan was to try and use the moonlight and the darkness to and use massive artillery, a bit like in World War I, something like 800 guns all at once, to have human minesweepers, engineers, sappers they call them, to go through and lift the mines one by one in the course of the night, and allow the British tanks to come through these lanes, establish themselves beyond the minefields, lure the Rommel's panzer forces and mobile forces towards them, and knock the hell out of them. From sort of dugout, they would sort of more or less dig themselves in, and with their artillery. Well, the infantry, these engineers moved forward, they lifted the mines, not perfectly, but incredible courage to do that. Got through pretty much the minefields, and the armor didn't go through. And that was when Monty, that's the test of a general, when things do not go according to plan. Now, one of the problems of the historian and biographer of Bernard Montgomery is that he claimed everything went according to plan, which was ridiculous, because in many ways his genius is that not only did he have a plan, and there are so many generals who didn't have a plan to grasp the initiative, but I think one of his great talents was that he could adapt and alter his plan as necessary. As he had these young staff officers whose job it was, he wasn't just going to sit at headquarters and listen to the radio. And certainly not the BBC. He would send these messengers out, really, like Wellington had his gallop, and to bring him, first-hand information about how far people had got according to plan, and what was the morale. They were young officers, but it was a sort of considerable responsibility to evaluate Well, they came back and they said, no, these guys just, the German 88, which was an anti-aircraft gun, was just lethal when used as an anti-tank gun. And many of those tank commanders had been through the war in the desert through 1942 and had suffered awful casualties, and they felt that their job was to kind of mop up afterwards.
Sure.
So they basically, and then they could become mobile. They didn't see a tank as moving artillery, if you like.
Yeah, as a battering ram. They saw it as a...
Well, but this was siege warfare. I mean, you couldn't change it. It was just 40 miles of mines. So Monty resisted. He tried to, demonstrate his willpower as the commander-in-chief of the army, but it didn't work. And within a couple of days, he had to accept that basically the British armor was not going to move through those lanes, and that the poor infantry, which meant the Australians and the Highlanders, 9th Australian Division and the 51st Highland Division, would have to do all the fighting. Well, he had prepared for that in his plan, and he called it crumbling, where the infantry advance, they take a lot of casualties, but the enemy can't just stand and watch themselves being eaten up by these kind of ants, termites, etc. So they have to and if the infantry take artillery with them, they can then pick off the German tanks, and that's what happened. And so really, the whole battle, the guts of the battle, day after day, 13 days of this, is a slogging match of infantry. I mean, after the war, Rommel's letters to his wife were published. And, they're very moving letters in where he tells of, how tormenting it is to, hear out in this sort of ridiculous desert, watching human beings just slaughtering each other and the blood running into the sand. But, it became a struggle of wills. Rommel couldn't watch it happen, this crumbling process going on and on. Those Highlanders, bless them, and Australians particularly, who took the most casualties in the battle. I mean, what they did really was historic at that moment in the war, being willing to take those kind of casualties. And, frankly, they won the Battle of Alamein, if we're talking about the ground level. And Monty won it in the sense that he had the will not to relinquish, to go on. If one attack was meeting too much resistance, he was determined to keep the initiative, so he would slightly alter the angle of the attack and switch from the Highlanders to the Australians. And each time Rommel kept thinking that he wasn't seeing any British tanks. So he was imagining that the British must be preparing a huge, knowing that they had well over 1,000 tanks from his intelligence. He kept thinking, oh, well, they're preparing for some huge tank attack. So I've got to deal with this now before it gets out of hand, before they, create too much of an opportunity for the tanks, without realizing that actually he was being lured onto these artillery anti-tank.
And you called that in your book Rommel's firefighting, I think, in the sense of trying to just smother something.
Exactly.
With all the power. And so that was luring them into a trap.
Yeah, but with men's lives, I mean,
yeah, of course.
that's the point where, a great commander is, I'd hesitate to say a psychopath, but you've got to be willing to, I interviewed Monty's chief of plans, Charles Richardson, and he said Monty called him in before the battle, and I think it was a couple of weeks before the battle, and he went into Monty's headquarters, that's right, in the desert and at Alamein, and he said, General, I have a question. How many casualties should I allow for in the coming battle? And Monty apparently took out a pen and started writing some numbers on his pad and said 13,000. When Richardson told me that, I thought, God, that's why I'm a historian.
Of course.
Not a soldier. I mean, that's casualties. So they're not
of course it's
killed, but I mean maimed, yes, and well over 3,000 were killed. And but he had been through World War One. In 1914, 1915, 16, 17, 18, he'd seen war in the trenches. He'd seen modern industrial warfare at its, particularly in terms of artillery and air power, at its worst. And that's the way it was. I think the pattern was very much the same.
And if I could ask, this is a question from Mr. Randy Barkhouse, which I think, is a segue into the battle. He asked, how much did the victory result from mistakes of Rommel's generals as compared to Monty's preparation? And it seems like if I can answer for you, the preparation was what won the day. And also, as you said, the ability to adjust on the fly.
Yes, to be honest, I don't think that Rommel did anything wrong. Well, no, that's not fair to say he didn't do, because apparently, he did write a very interesting report on the whole battle before he died, and Rommel, and he said in that report, he said, perhaps I should have launched a concentrated panzer counterattack and just tried to sort of obliterate it. Well, that's easily said, but after all my research, I don't see how he could have, because the Monty had another corps that was attacking in the south. It hadn't got very far, but it was there. He couldn't, he had to allow for the possibility that they would get through, and then do an end run on his own troops. So it took him days and days before he decided to bring all his panzers forces really to the north, by which time it was too late. But that was Monty's plan. I mean, this General Richardson told me that that he was in charge of the deception plan, which is the same as D-Day, of using an alternate, pretending that you're going to attack in one place and forcing the enemy, even if he doesn't think you will, but he's got to allow for it. So I don't know that I'd hesitate to say I pity Rommel, but he did make mistakes. Like, why wasn't he there at the battlefield?
Yes.
He's away from the most important battle of that year for him, and he's back at home in Wiener Neustadt in Austria.
Which is such as you know, the mirrors of June 1944, when he was
Yeah, he's
So
away
it's
again.
incredible. It's
Yeah,
incredible, these quirks of history that repeat themselves. So, you know, Nigel, with a few more moments here, I want to get to a few questions. But
sure.
before I ask you these questions, the battle ends. Tell us, where does Rommel go? And then we know Monty goes on to assist with Torch. Well, what happens to the Germans? Do they just simply exit through, you know, west of Egypt?
Oh yes, they retreat all the way. Rommel sends this message to Hitler saying, I can't stop it any longer. This is already on the 2nd of November. I can't hold it back. You know, we're going to have to retreat. And Hitler sends this message back saying, no, stand, die, you know, you are not to retreat. Well, that night on the 2nd of November, Rommel had already told his forces to retreat. But of course, the infantry had no vehicles. They're in the middle of the desert. What are you going to do? Over 50,000 Italians and Germans surrender. You know, this is an order of magnitude in terms of the war at that point, which is just night and day from what had led up to that moment. Here is Rommel, who's, you know, even Churchill in Parliament has, you know, paid tribute to Rommel as a great commander. I mean, you know, he'd become, I mean, I read Dr. Goebbels's diaries in German. I mean, the Germans were so proud and jubilant at what Rommel had achieved. But once he starts retreating, he maintains, he's really only able to retreat with his mobile forces, i.e., you know, anything that has wheels. And he retreats first to Foucault. He can't stand more than a couple of days there behind the line. Then he's basically going to Meuse-Matruh, and then basically going back past Tobruk and all the way back to Tunisia. And of course, it's in Tunisia that he's transferred to the American front. And, you know, interestingly, at Kasserine, he shows that
Kasserine Pass.
Rommel shows that hasn't sort of lost it. You know, still, you know, if you're not on your toes, this guy is really a tough cookie. But the main thing is that once he starts retreating on the night of November the 2nd, and the word goes out that the British Commonwealth has, you know, won this incredible victory and so forth. That is so important, significant for Roosevelt, because against the advice of the United States chiefs of staff, he has insisted that they will not have a D-Day and a D-Day disaster in 1942. They will land in Morocco, where apparently Admiral Lee here told him there were only 180 Germans, you know, to go where the enemy ain't. And so even though there were difficulties on Patton's Beach, you know, it was really a miracle that they, in bad weather, they landed okay. But, you know, that really is what persuaded the Vichy French that the Allies were going to win the war. And that's, to me, why this battle is so decisive. It's an interesting battle, as we were saying, for military historians, in terms of armor, artillery, infantry, mines, the RAF support. American bomber squadrons began operating during the battle, and did, you know, it's significant in its own right in terms of one of the decisive battles of history. But it's also significant in a strategic sense, you know, just as, yes, Stalingrad, Stalingrad is a turning point in the war, but Stalingrad isn't won until February of the following year. You know, this is the early fall of 1942, and it changes the whole texture of the war, and FDR's determination in agreement with his chiefs of staff of a policy of Germany first, not the Pacific. Yes, a two-ocean war, but Germany first, because as he, memorably wrote out for his chiefs of staff, when they disagreed with him, he said, look, if we just concentrate on the Japanese, we're still left with Hitler in control of the whole of Europe. But if we can, with the help of the Russians, if we can defeat the Nazis in Europe, the Japanese will not last long.
Yeah. Nigel, thank you for your expert analysis and your good good conversation. A man who knew both Field Marshal Montgomery and Sir Winston Churchill. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for taking the time.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Nigel. And everyone, take care. Happy holidays. And thank you for attending this conversation. It is recorded and it'll be on our YouTube page in the coming days. Thank you and take care.